Glory Cloud Podcast, Episode 26. We're going to delve into apologetics a little bit this episode, so stay tuned. Well, welcome back to the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. It's great to be with you again. I'm looking forward to our show today.
Yeah, me too. This is a direction that we haven't taken yet, so I'm looking forward to how this goes. I would just like to remind our listeners about our show notes page at meredithkline.com/podcast. Please do give us an iTunes rating. If you could give us 5 stars, that will really help us rise to the top as people search for good Christian content. We do appreciate your donations at the meredithkline.com/podcast page. That helps us to pay for the monthly hosting of our audio files, and we are trying to raise money for a new microphone for Lee. So we are getting donations in, and we appreciate every single one of them. Thank you very much. And now, Lee, let's get into our topic.
Okay.
So we mentioned a few episodes ago that the Canaanite Conquest was something that unbelievers often object to. And when we brought that up, we said, we should do an episode about that. And maybe that would provide some help in terms of apologetics as we and our listeners encounter people in our lives. And this is often a subject that causes people to stumble. Mm-hmm. So the story of God telling Israel to kill every living thing as they entered the promised land. According to Joshua 6 and other similar passages, God commanded Israel to destroy everything except Rahab and the members of her household. Mm-hmm. So there are many people who object to this. There's no shortage of places we could have turned, but I thought that the well-known atheist Richard Dawkins might be a good spokesman for an objection to this. So let's let him speak on this, and we'll interact with what he says afterward.
The ethnic cleansing begun in the time of Moses is brought to bloody fruition in the book of Joshua, a text remarkable for the bloodthirsty massacres it records and the xenophobic relish with which it does so. As the charming old song exultantly has it, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho and the walls came a-tumbling down. There's none like good old Joshua at the battle of Jericho. Good old Joshua didn't rest until they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass, with the edge of the sword. Joshua 6:21. Yet again, theologians will protest it didn't happen. Well, no, the story has it that the walls came tumbling down at the mere sound of men shouting and blowing horns. So indeed, it didn't happen. But that is not the point. The point is that whether true or not, the Bible is held up to us as the source of our morality. And the Bible story of Joshua's destruction of the Lebensraum of Jericho and the invasion of the Promised Land in general is morally indistinguishable from Hitler's invasion of Poland or Saddam Hussein's massacres of the Kurds and the Marsh Arabs. The Bible may be an arresting and poetic work of fiction, but it is not the sort of book you should give your children to form their morals. As it happens, the story of Joshua in Jericho is the subject of an interesting experiment in child morality by the Israeli psychologist George Tamarin. Tamarin presented to more than 1,000 Israeli schoolchildren aged between 8 and 14 the book of Joshua's account of the Battle of Jericho. He then asked the children a simple moral question. Do you think Joshua and the Israelites acted rightly or not? They had to choose between A, total approval, B, partial approval, and C, total disapproval. The results were polarized. 66% gave total approval and 26% total disapproval, with rather fewer, 8% in the middle with partial approval. Here are 3 typical answers from the total approval A group. In my opinion, Joshua and the sons of Israel acted well, and here are the reasons. God promised them this land and gave them permission to conquer. If they would not have acted in this manner or killed anyone, then there would be the danger that the sons of Israel would have assimilated among the Goyim. In my opinion, Joshua was right when he did it, one reason being that God commanded him to exterminate the people so that the tribes of Israel will not be able to assimilate amongst them and learn their bad ways. Joshua did good because the people who inhabited the land were of a different religion. And when Joshua killed them, he wiped their religion from the earth. The justification for the genocidal massacre by Joshua is religious in every case. Even those in category C who gave total disapproval did so in some cases for backhanded religious reasons. One girl, for example, disapproved of Joshua's conquering Jericho because in order to do so, he had to enter it. I think it is bad since the Arabs are impure, and if one enters an impure land, one will also become impure and share their curse. Tamarin ran a fascinating control group in his experiment. A different group of 168 Israeli children were given the same text from the book of Joshua, but with Joshua's own name replaced by General Lin and Israel replaced by a Chinese kingdom 3,000 years ago. Now the experiment gave opposite results. Only 7% approved of General Lin's behavior and 75% disapproved. In other words, when their loyalty to Judaism was removed from the calculation, the majority of the children agreed with the moral judgments that most modern humans would share. Joshua's action was a deed of barbaric genocide. But it all looks different from a religious point of view, and the difference starts early in life. It was religion that made the difference between the children condemning genocide and condoning it.
Okay, so that was Richard Dawkins, and he may not be the most charitable opponent of Christianity, but he certainly is one of the clearest. And he just said that God's command to Israel to kill every living thing in the land of Canaan was just plain wrong. And this is a major obstacle to others who have honest questions about Christianity. But it seems to us that we have to keep in mind that Dawkins is evaluating what we might call the Canaanite Conquest through the lens of common grace principles under which we live today. And our listeners can refer back to episode 11, where we gave an overview of the topic of common grace. But Lee, we have about 3 Christian attempts to deal with the story of the Canaanite conquest. Why don't we lay some of those out before we get into how we would understand this?
Yeah, so Christians and biblical scholars have tried to explain the conquest of the Canaanites and God's command to Joshua and the Israelites to devote the Canaanites to utter destruction. And they've come up with different theories, different ways of trying to make sense of it. And these are all ways that we would not identify with, but we just want to get them out on the table and look at them. So the first possibility is to reinterpret the conquest. So looking at the historical accounts and saying, well, these accounts are somewhat exaggerated. They're not accurate statements of what really happened. So this would be a position that would be held by higher critical scholars who would say that the conquest was not really a movement from without, but a peasant's revolt from within. And Kline himself actually mentions this reinterpretation in Kingdom Prologue on page 286, in which he critiques it and says, well, first of all, it's not what the text says. It wasn't just a peasants' revolt from within, trying to overthrow some sort of oppressive hierarchy that was over them. It was actually a conquest from without. But furthermore, Kline also points out that this reinterpretation has sort of an ideological motive within it, so that many of the higher critical scholars were favorable towards liberation theology. And so according to this interpretation, then, the Israelites, who are the peasants who revolted against the oppressive hierarchy of the Canaanites, they're the good guys now. And so it becomes sort of like a Marxist parable. So you can apply it to today, to whomever you think the good guys are that are revolting against those who are in power. So that's one way to try to get around it. Then it just makes the conquest a good thing. Now it's wonderful. The peasants are throwing off their overlords, and this is great. Kline has an interesting quote here on page 286. He says that to identify the redemptive kingdom of the God of the Hebrews with the common causes of the city of man is a profaning of the holy, a prostitution of the gospel, a diabolical repudiation of the atonement accomplished by Jesus Christ. So he's obviously against that first attempt to put a Marxist spin upon it. Another approach would be something like that advocated by Old Testament scholar Pete Enns. Pete Enns argues that basically what we have here, he would say, first of all of these stories about the destruction of the Canaanites are they're fiction. It didn't actually happen. It's just fiction. But that still is a problem, because the fiction is in the Bible. And so you have to explain, well, why would the Old Testament people, why would the Jews, the Israelites, why would they think that their God would have commanded them to do this? And basically what Pete Enns argues is that we don't have to believe everything written in the Bible. And so even though the Israelites had this view of God as a bloodthirsty, genocidal, tribal God, we've evolved in our religious and ethical consciousness since that time. And so that portion of the Bible is sub-Christian, and we need to use our discernment to criticize it and to say that part of the Bible is something that we don't agree with anymore. We just don't believe that. We don't believe that that's the kind of God that we believe in and that we worship today. So now both of these, the Marxist one and the Pete Enns religious evolution view, are unacceptable for Bible-believing Christians, because the first one basically says we can't trust the historical narrative. The second one says not only can we not trust the historical narrative, but we can't even trust the theological viewpoint of the biblical authors. But there's a third approach that you might hear among more evangelical Bible-believing Christians, who try to explain the conquest as being somehow acceptable according to the principles of just war. So someone, for example, like Paul Copan would argue that, I'm just quoting here from an interview that he gave on a website called BibleGateway.com in 2015. He was interviewed by by Jonathan Peterson. It was an interview with Drs. Paul Copan and Matthew Flanagan. Did God really command genocide? And some of the points that they make in here are good, but there are also points in the argument where they sort of slip into bringing in this idea of just war, the principles of common grace, according to Kline's thinking, and this is not correct. So he says, the Canaanites engaged in what we'd consider criminal activities: infant sacrifice, ritual sex, bestiality, incest, and Israel's calling would be harmed through their influence. Finally, in a supreme emergency, a good God would have moral justification for commanding something severe, though involving innocent lives lost. For example, fighter jets shooting down a hijacked commercial airliner to prevent extensive harm.
I'm not sure that's persuasive to me.
Yeah. So it's not as though the act that God is doing here in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites is simply, under some sort of just war theory that he's trying to prevent further injustice and further loss of innocent lives. That's not what God is doing. He is commanding them to destroy all of the Canaanites and to consign them to destruction. The Hebrew word is cherem, to devote them to utter destruction. And it's holy war. It's not something that can be explained using the moral justification of fighter jets shooting down a hijacked airliner to prevent further harm. That's not what's going on.
No. So, since that's not what's going on, and since the other theological, I should say, explanations that you've covered are not really available to us as Bible-believing Christians, why don't we lay out the biblical narrative and the different strands involved in that, so that we can situate this Canaanite conquest within that broader narrative?
Yeah, so that's very important. You have to go back to the beginning of the Bible, to the first chapters of Genesis, and see how God was planning from the very beginning that there would be an eschatological goal for creation, and that he would bring about the consummation of creation in a glorified, heavenized earth. And of course, he made a covenant with Adam, in which he told him, Genesis 2:17, that you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you eat of it, you will die. And of course, we know what happened. We know that Adam did that. He violated the terms of that covenant. He did eat of the tree, and he was subject to death and the curse as a result. And God himself even came in Genesis 3:8 in the spirit of the day, the Ruach Hayom, in judgment upon Adam. So that glorious eschatology was seemingly put on hold or not achieved, and judgment instead was the result. There was judgment right at the very beginning. The day of judgment happened in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8. And so that judgment is, that should have been the end of the Bible right there.
Right.
The Bible should have been 3 chapters long. And that's it. Eschatology offered, eschatology not achieved because of sin, and then the judgment is brought instead. But after the coming of God in judgment, God delayed the judgment. And so this sets up a whole process, a whole historical unfolding called common grace, which is God's non-saving grace to both the believer and the unbeliever alike. And this common grace arena means that judgment has been delayed. And why is that? Why has judgment been delayed, Chris?
So that God can save a people for himself, and ultimately to send the second person of the Trinity into human history as one of us in order to accomplish that.
Right. So the Son of God will become man. He will be the second Adam, who will undergo a probation just as the first Adam did, but he will succeed. And where Adam failed, he'll obey, and he will bring in that ultimate eschatology that was offered to Adam in the garden. And so this delay, the delay of common grace, is to prepare a history that will allow for the unfolding of that plan of salvation, first through a typological plan having to do with Israel and the land, and then through the antitype as Christ comes and is born under the law and fulfills it by his death on the cross and his perfect obedience in the fullness of time. But that judgment is still out there. That judgment that has been put on hold is still in abeyance, and there will be a day of judgment to come that will engulf all of those who are not elect, all those who are not under the terms of the covenant that God made with Christ, the second Adam, so that the people whom he saves will be delivered from that wrath, but the rest of mankind will be subjected to it.
Right. Yeah, that judgment is still pending. And I think it's important to point out as we think about that final judgment, we don't really hear moral objections to that because, even as we listened to Dawkins himself, he brought up very morally objectionable people like Hitler. Mm-hmm. And no one that I know would say that Hitler should just get off scot-free for what he did. Mm-hmm. We need that final judgment in order to look at the Hitlers of the world and say, God will bring justice to bear eventually. Mm-hmm. What a horrible place it would be to live in if there wasn't that final judgment. So, part of what we want to do in this episode is to point out that there's no moral objection that can be brought against the conquest of Canaan by Israel that cannot also be brought against the final judgment. Mm-hmm. So already by saying that, we're connecting the final judgment with what Israel was doing when they entered Canaan. And so we would have to say that the conquest of Canaan would be a type of that final judgment that's coming at the end of history.
Right. So going back to that really brief sketch of the whole narrative of the Bible, of God's plan from creation to consummation, the key thing is that you have the judgment coming in Genesis 3:8, but then you have God delaying the judgment. And then the reason for the delay is for God to save a people for himself. But then, like in your MP3 player, God's going to hit the unpause button and the judgment will fall at the very end. But what's interesting is that prior to that, so even during the time of the delay of this whole common grace period from immediately after the fall of Adam all the way up until Christ returns at the end of history and the day of judgment happens, however long that period of time is, within that, God does bring about these anticipations of the day of judgment.
Right.
And the way Kline describes that is he calls those intrusions. They're intrusions of the eschatological judgment that is put on abeyance. The final day is still out there, but we see these anticipations of it at various points during the time of the delay. And so the conquest of the Canaanites is one example of that. It's one intrusion of the eschatological judgment into the time of the delay. So, for example, on page 87 at Kingdom Prologue, Kline says that Israel's conquest and dispossession of the Canaanites was carried out in fulfillment of their status as a nation of priests who were commissioned to cleanse the land claimed by Yahweh as holy to him. The priestly character of this and other such holy war undertakings was accentuated by the prominent role which the special Levitical priesthood within priestly Israel was assigned in them. So, for example, you have in Deuteronomy 20, verse 10, the laws concerning holy war. It says, when you draw near to the battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people and shall say, Hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near for battle against your enemies. So the priests are out in the front, and they have a significant role in this holy war. And you see that also in Joshua 3, verse 3, and Joshua 6, verse 4, and following. Reading on, similarly, Messiah, in his going forth in the great final judgment for the cleansing of God's cosmic temple, a judgment adumbrated in the temple cleansings recorded in the Gospels, is depicted in prophetic psalm and apocalypse as a priest king leading a priestly army. Psalm 110, verse 3, Revelation 19:11. So Kline is making the parallels then between Israel as a Levitical priesthood, as a priestly nation going into the land, and Christ as the king priest, or the priest king leading a priestly army to cleanse the cosmic temple. Okay. And so if we have a problem with the morality of the conquest, then we would also have to have a problem with the very concept that there will be a final judgment at the end, because the conquest is simply an adumbration. It's simply a foreshadow in a smaller scale, in a smaller geographical arena that is looking ahead to the final judgment that will be brought about through Christ, the second Adam.
Right. So we grasp the need for the final judgment because of the universal sinfulness of humanity. Mm-hmm. That comes because of what Adam plunged us into when he disobeyed God.
Right.
So the problem really is not why God judged the Canaanites, since we're now seeing the parallel between the Canaanite conquest and the final judgment. The problem is why God doesn't judge everybody.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And that's really interesting too, if we go back to the Deuteronomy 20 passage, because God does make a distinction between the cities that are far away from the Israelites versus the cities that are, I guess in contrast to that, close to them, mm-hmm. within the borders of Canaan that they were going into. He tells them that, should we just read the passage?
Yeah, go ahead and read it.
Okay, let me get there just a moment.
It's Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 18.
So that says, when you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword. But the women and the little ones, the livestock and everything else in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as plunder for yourselves. And you shall enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you.
So in that first part that you just read, it's talking about the cities that are far. That is, they're not located in the direct area of the inheritance that they're about to obtain, correct?
Right. So the inheritance really is the key there. These cities where they are to offer terms of peace first are not within the inheritance. Mm-hmm. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not cities of the nations here. But in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. When you besiege a city for a long time, making war against it in order to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field human that they should be besieged by you? Only the trees that you know are not trees for food you may destroy and cut down, that you may build siege works against the city that makes war with you until it falls. So within the geopolitical borders of the inheritance that God was giving to his people, an inheritance that was a miniature picture of heavenized earth. They were to destroy every living thing, minus fruit-bearing trees, apparently. But the point being that what was currently in them was unholy, and they needed to make it holy.
Mm-hmm. So God was carving out a geopolitical arena within the earth. We could call that the Holy Land, the Promised Land, the inheritance, the land of Canaan. And this is the sphere that God is setting apart, that is going to be a picture and a type of the new creation. And within the boundaries of that land, the principles of common grace are suspended.
That's very important.
When they're attacking someone, when they're drawing near to a city outside of that land, then they're to use common grace principles, and just war theory would come into play at that point. But when they're within the land, it is something different. It is an intrusion of the consummation within the period of the delay.
Right. So to return to Kline's term intrusion that he uses for that principle of the final judgment that is coming into history during Israel's lifetime, but is obviously not the ultimate final judgment, because even we are still waiting for that. We can see Kline's definition of that term intrusion on page 156 of Structure of Biblical Authority. He says, intrusion is a coming of the Spirit, an intrusion of the power, principles, and reality of the consummation into the period of delay. Mm-hmm. So God established that delay. He hit the pause button, as you said, in Genesis chapter 3. And so Israel is living within that period of delay, but in this particular area, you could have put a literal fence around the area that we're talking about. There's no delay inside that fence.
Right.
And we see other episodes of this intrusion outside of the Canaanite conquest. For example, Noah's flood would be an example of intrusion. Mm-hmm. You definitely see the principle of final judgment at work in God flooding the earth and killing all living creatures, unless they could swim, I suppose. We have Sodom and Gomorrah. Those are some very pointed illustrations of the principle of intrusion. And then we arrive after that at the Canaanite conquest. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in that same section of the Structure of Biblical Authority that you quoted from, Kline addresses the conquest explicitly on pages 162 to 164. And he has this great little thought experiment where he says, if Israel's conquest of Canaan were to be adjudicated before an assembly of nations acting according to the provisions of common grace, that conquest would have to be condemned as an unprovoked aggression, and moreover, an aggression carried out in barbarous violation of the requirement to show all possible mercy, even in the proper execution of justice. Mm. And so, I'm thinking of like the International Court of Justice, right, in The Hague, where things like this are adjudicated, where nations can complain against other nations for unprovoked aggression and so on. So what Kline is saying here is that essentially we have to distinguish between an ethics of common grace and an ethics of the intrusion, or the ethics of the consummation that is being intruded into the midst of history.
Right.
So he basically says that, if we were to judge Israel's conquest according to the ethics of common grace, it would be condemned. But we have to view it according to a different ethic, and that is the ethic of the intrusion. He says it will only be the frank acknowledgement that ordinary ethical requirements were suspended and that ethical principles of the last judgment intruded, that the divine promises and commands to Israel concerning Canaan and the Canaanites come into their own. Only so can the conquest be justified.
Right.
And then we have to, so part of the problem here is, when you go back to the Dawkins quote, and he's saying, you don't want to give the Bible to your children to teach them morals. And then he talks about that study that was done by the Israeli professor, and how when the children were asked about some other incident, some fictional story of some Chinese aggression, in ancient history, they were able to condemn it. What you have here is this: you're looking at someone, Dawkins, who is looking at the conquest through the lens of ordinary common grace ethics.
Right.
And of course, if you view it from that point of view, if that's all you think it is, and that's how you're viewing it, that's the grid through which you're looking at it, then of course you're going to say it was barbaric, it was ethnic cleansing, it was
genocide.
It was genocide. It was unprovoked aggression. So we have to condemn it. But Kline is saying, no, we have to put on a different filter here, a different lens, and see it as the day of judgment. He says that when we do that, we see that it's not murder, but rather it's the hosts of the Almighty visiting upon the rebels against his righteous throne, their just deserts. Not robbery, but the meek inheriting the earth.
Mm. Right, because when we think about... It's easy if we think about the Hitlers, right? Uh-huh. They deserve that judgment at the end. And no one's going to object to Hitler being judged at the final judgment and say, "Oh, that's murder. You can't do that to Hitler." And so that same principle is at work in this little miniature picture of the final judgment within the borders of Canaan. And I think it's important to keep in mind that final judgment actually has 2 episodes to it. Maybe we can get a running start at those 2 episodes by giving a brief or rough sketch of the history of God's covenants with humanity. So again, going back to the very beginning, God offers Adam the new creation for his obedience. Without going into a lot of detail, we could see that in the tree of life. We can see that in what the New Testament says about the Sabbath, looking back to the original rest of God in chapter 2 of Genesis. And then God gives Adam and Eve the promise of the new creation even after their fall because of a future descendant of theirs. In Genesis 3:15, we have God promising a curse upon the serpent that is going to come by means of a descendant of Eve's.
I'll go ahead and read that. Okay. This is right after the fall. The Lord is giving his judgment upon the serpent. He says in verse 14, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring." And of course, we have the messianic part in the second half. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. But before you get to that, before you get to the messianic he, there's these two offsprings. Your offspring, that is the offspring or the seed of the serpent, and her offspring, the seed of the woman. And I think it's helpful to keep in mind that in the immediate context of Genesis, just looking at the book of Genesis itself, and not yet looking ahead to the New Testament and the fulfillment of this, who is the seed of the woman? Well, isn't it Abraham and his descendants? Isn't it this whole promise that God gave to Abraham, that I will multiply your seed and give them the land? And who's the seed of the serpent? Well, isn't it the Canaanites? Isn't it the very ones that God himself mentioned when he made the promise to Abraham concerning his seed in Genesis 15? Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land, and then I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. But as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And then he says, to your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cabanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.
Right.
So the seed of the serpent is all of those
ites.
Canaanites, yes, the ites, that are also mentioned again when you read earlier from Deuteronomy 20. Those same ites are mentioned again in Deuteronomy 20, verse 17. You shall devote them to complete destruction, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, etc.
So that's very important to keep in mind, that there is a first level fulfillment. It's so easy for us to just automatically go to Satan and Christ,
right,
in Genesis 3:15. But like you said, within the book of Genesis itself, the descendant of the serpent is all of those ites, the people living within Canaan, and the descendant of Eve is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
That's right.
And I mentioned them because, yes, God originally makes the covenant with Abraham, but then he renews it with Isaac and with Jacob. And when Israel arrives on the scene of history, that's when God claims the geopolitical territory of Canaan as his very own, as the place where he is going to establish his kingdom. Now, granted, it's not the ultimate kingdom. It is only a first level fulfillment of his promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, but it is still a fulfillment. And since God claims that territory as his own, it must be holy.
Right.
We read in other places in Scripture that God cannot dwell with sin, and so he's going to cleanse this area for his dwelling with his people. And that's why God tells Israel that they must not spare the life of anyone living in that land, minus Rahab and her household.
Right.
So, then when Jesus comes on the scene of history, he enters history within the context of the covenant that God had made with Israel. He arrives in this holy land. The very first episode of God's ultimate final judgment rains down on Christ as he hangs on the cross. I think that's important to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you could say that the conquest of the Canaanites is an anticipation of the cross as well. Not only is it an anticipation of the final judgment at the end, it's an anticipation of the cross.
Right.
And you see it in several aspects. Like one aspect of it is, the whole idea of the Colossians 2:15 passage where Paul talks about Christ stripping the powers so that the cross is a victory against the rulers and the authorities, the triumph of Christ. He disarmed the rulers and the authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in the cross.
Right.
So you could see that in the conquest, because Joshua is a type of Christ, and he is going in and he is conquering the Canaanites. He is crushing the serpent, right?
Yes.
And so that's a picture of Christ on the cross, crushing the serpent and stripping the powers. But there's another aspect of it too, which I think you just alluded to, which is that in a sense, we are all Canaanites, right?
Yes.
I mean, in a sense, we are all worthy of that judgment. And yet Christ bore it in our place. So he took the wrath for us.
Absolutely. And I think that answers perhaps the objection that might say, well, okay, if God is cleansing Canaan of unholiness, why wasn't Israel wiped out at the same time? Mm-hmm. Well, God takes, yes, you and I and everyone listening to this podcast deserves to be wiped out too. We are unholy. God is holy. But if you are trusting Christ to save you from your sins, God dealt with the judgment that you deserved when Christ was hanging on the cross. Mm-hmm. That was episode 1 of the final judgment. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you there.
No, that sounds good.
Everyone deserves final judgment, and you want to be included with Christ in episode 1 of the final judgment. You don't want to find yourself standing alone when he arrives again for episode 2 of the final judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thinking back to the time of Israel, we could see the same concept with them, right? Because if you go back to Exodus and the judgments that God brought upon the Egyptians, they were in a sense also judged, right? They were the people of Israel were also judged because they had to offer the Passover lamb as a substitute.
Absolutely.
And anyone who did not have the Passover blood slathered upon their doorposts would be subject to that destroying angel that was coming in and destroying all the firstborn. And so because of that, because God was destroying all the firstborn of Egypt and would have destroyed the firstborn of Israel as well unless they had offered the sacrificial substitute, it's as if Israel themselves have also undergone that judgment. And that's why Exodus 13:1, the Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn."
Right.
Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and of beast, is mine. Because Israel has undergone that judgment through a representative. Mm. And so when they come into the land to execute God's judgment upon the Canaanites, they're not doing so as those who can claim that somehow they are innocent and righteous, and they're just going to, judge these Canaanites for their wickedness. They're coming as those who have been redeemed and purchased, as those who themselves have had to undergo that judgment.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So there's an equality there. There's an inequality in the outcome, but there's an equality in terms of everyone stands before the bar of divine justice as worthy of judgment.
Right. Everyone has to go through God's judgment.
Right.
But you want to go through it with a substitute in your place.
That's right.
Which points out, I think, that God doesn't show any partiality. He's not looking at ancient Israel, and he's not looking at you and me and saying, oh, well, I'll wink at your sin, and I'm just going to get everyone else. Mm-hmm. No. Romans 2:11 actually brings this out. Let me get there, unless you can beat me to it.
Well, I'll let you go there, but just keep in mind the whole context of what Paul is arguing there in Romans 1, 2, and 3. He's arguing that both Jews and Gentiles are equally guilty in the sight of God,
right?
And that everyone, he says in Romans 3:19, that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God.
That's a great point. So Romans 2:11 says that God shows no partiality, but you're right. And I've always been impressed by the litany that he goes through in chapter 3, cataloging all the different body parts and how they are sinful. Mm-hmm. And by the time he's done with that, in verse 18 or so, nobody is left standing.
That's right.
Every human being, except for Christ, stands condemned under God's law.
Mm-hmm. He even says earlier in chapter 3 of Romans, he says, if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? Mm. So the very concept that there is going to be a day of judgment, that God is going to judge the world, and that the Jews who seem to be, they seem to have some advantage because they are circumcised and they're in a covenant relationship with God. And yet Paul is saying that in reality, that's not going to make any difference on the day of judgment, that God is going to judge equally both Jew and Gentile based upon whether they have kept the law. The Jews, of course, have the law. The Gentiles don't have the written law, but they do have the law of the moral law is written upon their heart. And they'll be judged by that according to their conscience. And so the result is that what then? Are we any better off? No, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one.
And so everyone deserves God's judgment.
Right.
And that's, to bring it back to the situation with Israel, that's why the conquest was not genocide. It's because the judgment wasn't targeted at the Canaanites, all of those ites, because of their iteness, because of their race.
Right.
It was targeted at them because of their wickedness.
Right.
And Moses and Joshua both talk about all of the idolatry and all of the other horrible things that they engaged in. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about how Israel actually underwent judgment in type and shadow in the crossing of the Red Sea. But now that they've arrived at the border of Canaan, they are to make it holy, just as God has made them holy. Although the Canaanites aren't going to be represented by a substitute. But it's interesting that Israel isn't let off the hook, even as mm-hmm. they are heading in to cleanse the land. Mm-hmm. They're told in Leviticus chapters 18 and 20 that the land that vomited out the Canaanites will also vomit out the Israelites if they defile themselves like the Canaanites did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Leviticus 18 is that list of all the unlawful forms of sexual relationships, but it also includes some other things in there too, like you shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech. And so these are this incest, the offering of the children in child sacrifice. These are the practices that the Canaanites did. And God is saying to the Israelites, okay, now that you're coming into the land, don't be like them. Don't make yourselves unclean by any of these things. Leviticus 18:24, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. Parentheses, for the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean. He was repeating himself. End parentheses, lest the land vomit you out. when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you.
So the area is marked off as holy, and if unholiness is in it, it's going to be cleansed. Right?
Yeah. So it's not as though God is simply directing his wrath against the Canaanites just because they're Canaanites.
Right.
It's not a racial issue. It's because of their sin. And so the Israelites are also subject to the same judgment if they commit those same sins.
Right. So that's important to bear in mind.
I mean, that answers Dawkins' claim that it's ethnic cleansing.
Right.
It's not ethnic cleansing.
And it's not genocide.
Right. And in fact, we know that there were cases where this very type of devotion to utter destruction happened to the Israelites. Back in Numbers 25, when there was a man who was committing idolatry and who took a Midianite woman into his tent, Phinehas rose up and killed both. He killed the Israelite man and the Midianite woman as expression of this same principle of God's holiness. And then later on in Joshua chapter 7, you have the sin of Achan, which is often ignored by these polemicists like Dawkins, right? So they'll focus on Joshua 6. Oh, that's great for them. The whole thing about the fall of Jericho and killing all the women and the children. They love that, but then they don't read on in Joshua 7, the very next chapter, where one of the Israelites becomes subject to the very same destruction. Why? Because he took some of the things that were devoted to destruction, a Canaanite garment, and so on, and so he himself and his family were destroyed as part of the same expression of God's holy wrath and judgment against sin. So God is not a respecter of persons. He's not just picking out the Israelites because of their race. He's focused upon the issue of justice.
Right. And his holiness in the face of sin.
That's right.
And then ultimately, the sin of that Israelite man with the Midianite woman and the sin of Achan spreads like leaven throughout Israel to the point that God sends his prophets as covenant attorneys and prosecutes a lawsuit against them, and Israel still doesn't repent, and so he sends in both the Babylonians and the Assyrians to carry Israel off into exile.
Right. Because
they were committing the kinds of sins that the Canaanites were committing within that geopolitical boundary.
Right. And so even though those verses in Leviticus that we read are only given in the form of a potential outcome that the land may vomit you out, we know that in reality the land will vomit them out.
Right.
Just as it vomited out the Canaanites.
Well, I think we've exhausted that. Do you have any other thoughts or closing remarks?
I just have one thought. I think it's interesting to note that there is this interesting connection between the seed and the land. You see that back in Genesis 15, when God makes the promise to Abraham, to your seed, I will give this land. But you also see the alternative, kind of the mirror image of that when you look at the Canaanites. They're the seed of the serpent. They're also dwelling in the land, but they're defiling the land and they're defiling themselves. And so the land vomits them out. And so there's this interesting connection between the people and the land, between these are the two main aspects of God's whole plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you go back to the pre-fall situation and you contemplate the eschatological goal was for Adam to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then eventually, once that whole process of fulfilling the cultural mandate is complete, once megapolis is done, then it will all be eschatologized and it will become metapolis. It'll become the New Jerusalem. And so the people will be glorified, their bodies will be glorified, and their environment, the new creation, will also be glorified. And there'll be this perfect harmony of people and land living together, of course, with God himself being present in the midst of it, and the whole thing becoming like a glorious temple for God to dwell in. And then you fast forward all the way to the end of the Bible, to Revelation 21 and 22, and you see the same picture. You see the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God as a bride adorned for her husband. But what is the New Jerusalem? It's the people. It's the bride of Christ.
Right.
And yet they're dwelling in the new creation, which has been purged of all sin. It'll be cleansed of all unrighteousness and all sin, as Peter says in 2 Peter 3:10, and it'll be a place in which righteousness dwells. And so I just think it's interesting that these two dimensions of the people and the land are so consistent throughout Scripture from the beginning of the Bible to the end. And it just sort of helps to clarify a little bit about what is God's purpose. What is he trying to do? It's a very physical thing. He wants us to have physical glorified bodies living in a physical glorified creation.
Right.
That's what he's after. And so we see that in the typological arena, when we're talking about Israel going into the land, we see the same thing, but it's all in type and shadow, where God has to judge the people, but also cleanse the land so that God's holy people can dwell in the land and build the temple. And so all the anticipations that we find in the Old Testament are helping us to flesh out the meaning of what is this eschatological goal that God has in mind for us.
That's very helpful. So that really, it's helpful for seeing the Canaanite conquest in the context of the total biblical story from creation to consummation.
Right. If you take it out of that context and you just look at it as, from the point of view of the principles of common grace and the International Court of Justice, then you won't see what's going on. You'll completely misunderstand it. But if you look at it in the context of that whole narrative, then suddenly it comes out, and we can understand what God is doing, and it makes sense. Right. One last thing, we'll just close with this. I like how Kline says on page, this is in The Structure of Biblical Authority, and it's on page 162. He says, he's talking about the imprecations in the Psalms, and he says, we must distinguish an ethics of the consummation from an ethics of common grace. And the imprecations in the Psalms confront us unexpectedly with a pattern of conduct which conforms to the ethics of the consummation. So these imprecations calling down God's wrath upon the enemies of God's people, since it is intruded by inspiration, it constitutes a divine abrogation within a limited sphere of the ethical requirements normally enforced during the course of common grace. What is required is that we cease stumbling over this as though it were a problem, and recognize it as a feature of the divine administration of the covenant of redemption in the Old Testament, a feature that displays the sovereign authority of the covenant God. It is also bright with promise for the future of his kingdom and people. For to make explicit the obvious, this ethical intrusion appropriately attaches itself to the activity of persons and institutions which were types of things to come in the age of the consummation. But I like that part there in the middle where he says, what is required is that we cease stumbling over this.
Right. It's not to quote Bill Baldwin from a previous episode, it's not a bug, it's a feature.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
So, well, Lee, thank you very much. I really enjoyed discussing that.
Yeah, it's been good.
And I hope that it has been encouraging for our listeners too. Maybe it will help as you encounter people in your life who do stumble over this. Hopefully this will give you a narrative within which to situate the Canaanite conquest. Mm-hmm. And if you have follow-up questions, or if you have any other ideas about this that you'd like to run by us, please do email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com and send us voicemail. And we'll see you again next week.